you so much. Thank you for coming today. I am honored to be able to introduce Wallace Daniel. Dr. Wallace Daniel is the Distinguished University Professor of History at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. He served as Mercer's Provost from 2008 to 2012. Prior to joining Mercer, he was the Ralph and Bessie Mae Lynn Professor of History at Baylor, where he spent much of his earlier career teaching in the history department. He has served as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences from 1996 to 2005. He also served as the chair of the Department of History from 1992 to 1996, and served as the editor of the Journal of Church State that is on campus. His scholarly expertise is in Russian history with a special emphasis on the period of Catherine the Great and Russian cultural and social history after the fall of the Soviet state. He is also a member of Phi Beta Kappa. His undergraduate and graduate degrees were from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In 2008, he won the very prestigious award, the Cornelia Marshall Smith Award here at Baylor University for teaching, scholarship, and service. He has a long list of publications and books, and his most recent project is working on Alexander Min, the renowned Paris priest in Russia who was murdered in 1990. When he sent me his information, I asked for his information, although I knew much of it. He said he preferred brief introductions. I think he was trying to keep me from telling any kind of stories about him. And many of you in the room have your own stories of interaction and fun, and maybe some more stories too. But I'm so glad that you are here today, and we welcome you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for not telling those stories.
Thank you for that gracious, that very warm, that very kind introduction. And thank you also for being here today. I see so many friends, so many longtime friends in this audience. So many memories come back when I look out there. They're all so positive. And I also want to thank Michael Bordeaux, who's been such an inspiration to not only to me, but to anyone working in this field of religion and politics in Russia, Eastern Europe, or more broadly across the world. It's hard to think about this subject without thinking about Michael Bordeaux. In the West, in general, we have a stereotypical picture of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it runs, you see it widespread, both in the popular press and even in scholarly works. And it is a picture, an image, of the church as closely allied with the Russian state. In 1943, when Joseph Stalin resurrected the church, or revived the church, he did it for political reasons, to stimulate the national spirit and to co-opt it for the war effort. This was done during some of the darkest days of World War II. And then afterwards, as you know, following the war, the church became closely allied with the state. We have images of people going to conferences to parlay a particular line about disarmament and about peace negotiations. And we saw that over and over. And the picture we gained, again from most accounts, was that the Russian Orthodox Church was compliant, complicit, lacked energy, lacked creativity, lacked vigor, and really, in the end, a handmaiden of the state. Now, I began to become interested in these issues in the middle of the 1990s, and in part because I was suspicious of those stereotypes that are so widespread. I had a sense, in part, that the picture, the reality, was much more complex than the way we were seeing it normally portrayed in so much of our publications. And in part, I became suspicious because of the meetings with two people in Moscow about this time who encouraged me to look a little bit deeper. One of them was a then young sociologist of religion named Sergei Filatov. I had a series of meetings with him about 1996 and 97. The second person, I want to speak more about him a bit later. The second person was a nun, an 81-year-old nun, a former award-winning molecular chemist who'd won every prize in chemistry that one can imagine in the old Soviet Union, who'd been recently appointed to help revive the famous Novodevichy Women's Monastery in Moscow. When I first met her in her office, the sunlight streaming through the windows to the side of where she was sitting, she pulled down from the shelf a photographic album and opened it up, and on the first page of that album was a picture of her mother and father standing with Tsar Nicholas II and Alexandria. The second image she showed me that day was a picture of her grandfather. His name was Leonid Mikhailovich Chichagov, a former priest, an artist, a writer, a man of renown, who was taken away from his church in 1937. Mother Seraphima, this nun, was living with him at the time, taken away in 1937 and shot, and his image and his memory were forever removed from the books, forever removed. When I came away from that meeting with her, as from Filatov, I became convinced that the memory was going to be perhaps the key to the future of this country, and that what memories were brought back and what memories were not back were going to shape the future of this society, what would be suppressed and what would be restored. And so what I'm talking about right now is the question of who are the memory keepers? If memory is to be recovered, who are those keepers? In this fast-paced world in which we live, not only there, but also here, who holds the keys? Who holds the keys to the family's memories? Where are they located? To many people, it's just like Mother Seraphima. It's photographs. It's in photographs. And photographs, wrote Mikhail Ignatieff and Susan Sontag in this country, both remind us that photographs are a family's court of memory. And they tell us that they provide a sense of connection in times of fragmentation, expatriation, and migration. It's generally all some people have. And in a secular culture, photographs are, to quote Ignatieff, are the only household items, the only objects that perform the religious function of connecting the living to the dead, the only items, and of locating identity of the living in time. In a famous essay that Susan Sontag wrote on this subject, she describes photographs as a new kind of inheritance, a figment of identity in her words. They recall the past, but they also bear witness to connections. And in my conversations with her, Mother Seraphima told me that she often looked at the photograph of her grandfather and her eyes seemed to call her back. Her eyes, his face seemed to restore that. Now, in a country like Russia, as in many other places, including to some extent our own, of course Larry McMurtry wrote a famous book on this subject, our country and Russia, that certainly to a great extent, suffered from a kind of collective amnesia. Shortly after becoming patriarch in 1990, Alexei II described the loss of memory, the loss of connection, the loss of culture as the most important issue facing his country in the future. So on the success of that venture, he said a large part of the country's future will ride. But where are the sources of those memories? Where are they kept that connect the past to the future? Might they offer a different way of looking at the church and state than we normally have or have been in the popular press? Where are the memories kept? Memories that, in Patriarch Alexei's II words, will connect the past to the future and open the future to the present. Where do we find them? When Mother Seraphima was given Novodevichy Monastery to restore in the late 1990s, she knew that she first had to recover the past. She had to learn the story of her grandfather, one on whose memory she hoped to build. And so she told me that she went to KGB headquarters and asked for the files on her grandfather, and the person who kept the files looked at her and was silent. She went away somewhat depressed, and she said, "I remained depressed for a good time." And then, one day, a friend told her that there was a woman living in Moscow who might be able to help her, gave her the address. And so, one day, Mother Seraphima set out to find this person. And she found the apartment in a suburb of Moscow. She did not expect to learn anything. She rang the bell, and she found there an old woman living in a very small apartment, crammed with files of index cards on all the walls of her small apartment. This person, Mother Seraphima said, had worked for several years in the KGB headquarters in the files, had friends who were there, and she had gone about taking notes on these people who were shot in the 1930s, particularly priests who were shot in the 1930s. She learned about these people from various sources, she said, some of whom I've named. She had the names of 20,000 people written on these cards, said Mother Seraphima. She had these boxes of cards lining the shelves of her small apartment, every wall covered with these index boxes. She'd worked on them for many years. She said, "No one has ever asked me for them, and I despaired that they would ever come to light." They told her exactly what had happened to her grandfather. She said she shook when the box was open for 1937 and her grandfather's card was pulled out. Now, similarly, the materials in the Keston collection are also part of the story. A great deal of the narrative still remains to be uncovered and told, as we heard yesterday. They will give a richer and deeper picture of the intersection between politics and religion than we presently have for most of the 20th century. And when I think of them, I think of a young person named Michael Bordeaux studying in Moscow, buying on the street the first copy of the journal Science and Religion, Nauka y Religia, the first copy, not knowing, I think, how rare that issue would become, and taking it home. And I think of a house in Elton, England, where a collection started, and then a building in the village of Keston, and then Oxford, and after that at Baylor, one of the richest, one of the finest collections of primary source materials on Eastern Europe anywhere in the world. And since both Great Britain and the United States are involved in this story connects to us as well. The materials in this archive belie the stereotype I started this talk with of an apathetic Orthodox clergy mentioned a few minutes ago. They present a much more complex view, a much more multifaceted picture. They are examples in that archive of active, dynamic men and women who reached out to people and presented alternative ways of looking at this story. I think of the charismatic priest Alexander Min, whom we've mentioned several times, whose legacy is still revered in Moscow and whose books are still published in Moscow. 5 million of them still remain in print. I think of Father Gleb Yakunin, who's mentioned several times, this courageous dissident, this human rights leader whom the KGB could not break and whose story is in the archive here. And there are the works of this sociologist Sergei Filatov and his team, this multi-volume work that details religious life all over this country, every corner of this vast country, not nearly as widely appreciated as it deserves to be, but hopefully will be. The past, as the distinguished geographer David Lowenthal has written, is never etched in stone. It's never immutable. It's never lost unless we lose it ourselves. It's always there, it's always changing, it's always present, and is part of the future. So again, whose version of the Russian past will be widely accepted? We might project outward 10 to 20 years from now and think about what that story might look like. And I know that historians are very bad predictors of the future and almost always wrong. But with some trepidation, I want to suggest 4 or 5 things that may come to be very important and could be worked on here. Some of them we already have, some of them are going to take a little bit more work, but can be easily gained. And I want to suggest about 5 themes that, looking out 10 to 20 years from now, might come more fully into view. They're already playing a role. First, I think of a very remarkable woman named Margarita Morozova, who lived in Moscow in the first half of the 20th century. She was the widow of a wealthy merchant family. She had in her mansion in the old Arbat section of Moscow before the Russian Revolution, she held a weekly seminar. And that seminar was attended by the very elite of the Russian intelligentsia, Berdyaev, Bulgakov, these great names, but also a young man named Yevgeny Trubetskoy, whose book, Icons, A Theology in Color, is a tour de force. Morozova went on to finance a printing press called Put, The Way, in which a debate took place, a debate about the issues that are presently confronting us right now. The relationship between religion and culture, the secular and the sacred, the church and the state. Second, we have no scholarly biography of one of Russia's greatest religious thinkers, Gleb Yakunin. Courageous, outspoken, unbroken by years of prison. He offers a much different picture of the Russian clergy than we presently have, than I started this talk with. He poses an alternative, not only to the state, but also to the traditional Orthodox Church in a country that much needs these alternatives. Third, we are seeing a significant change in the composition of Russian Protestants. A generation ago, as Sergei Filatov's studies remind us, show clearly, Russian Protestants were peasants and workers and were poorly educated. In the last 10 years, as again his studies show, this is no longer the case. A Protestant intelligentsia has emerged, including many humanists and economists, and very well-educated people, and they are becoming a real cultural force. They are going to affect politics in the next decade, he says. Fourth, this is a large global issue. The Columbia scholar Miroslav Volf calls this one of the two most important problems in the world right now. And that is the problem of how different religious faiths can live together, learn to live together peacefully. Given a rapidly changing religious landscape, not only here but virtually everywhere, the need for dialogue between these religious traditions and religious faiths has never been more important, never been more pressing. As one looks outward to the future, the significance of that dialogue becomes not only critical, it may be important for our survival in the future. Dialogue between those different traditions and those different faiths was a major concern of Father Alexander Min, who read and loved the novels of Graham Greene, the English novelist. Graham Greene, of course, who wrote constantly about this theme, about dialogue, and whose book, The Power and the Glory, one of the great novels of the 20th century, was translated by the Min Foundation this year and distributed. The Keston collection contains a wealth of material on dialogue and the importance of dialogue. Last, when looking at Russia, in my view, we've paid far more attention to the surface, to the ocean, to the white caps on top of the water, than to what is underneath the political hierarchy, to the rise and fall of tides that lie deep within the surface. Keston invites us to explore beneath the surface to the question that Gogol posed in Dead Souls of whither Russia, where are you going? Now, in looking at the future, we don't want to miss the emergence of an Orthodox intelligentsia that has come into being following the 2012 presidential election, this controversial election in 2012. What's so striking about this group is that it is not connected to the church, but it is nourished by the church, by the church's ideals. The members of this group, and they range across the board, from academics to journalists to business people to mass media personnel. This group holds a wide diversity of views, and they fly in the face of the model we hold of a unified church and a unified society. What's interesting about this group, as a recent study by Nadezhda Kozinko has shown, is that a large number of this group is composed of women, of female. Women, she claims, now command the expanding field of religious media in Russia. Social networks, bookstores, blogs, television, movie production studios. The most prominent of these women is the editor-in-chief of the leading Orthodox website, the editor-in-chief of the theological journal Alpha and Omega, the leading documentary filmmaker in Russia, and I can name many, many more. And there are others who are challenging the traditional relationship between the church and the state. They are raising some very sharp questions about society and what it means to pursue the common goal. And they're raising some sharp questions about what it means to be flourishing citizens. What is perhaps most important here is that this group is not going to back down. They're going to pursue it as far as it's possible. And I would submit that is a story that needs to be told if we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. Thanks very much. be glad to take any questions or any dissent. There's a lot of dissent here.
I do have a question.
Go right ahead.
Regarding Islam in Russia, can you comment some on that? Because you mentioned right now in these 5 points, predominantly dealing with like Christianity, Protestantism, and the Orthodox Church.
Did you say Islam?
Yes.
It's believed that when he carried his briefcase that morning he was murdered in September 1990, that Father Alexander Min was carrying a manuscript dealing with this very subject of Islam and Orthodoxy. The relationship is strained, it is difficult, it is complex, but it raises once more and underlines once more the importance of dialogue between these two traditions. And at the next session that we have, I want to suggest that the question of let me put it this way. Religion is used for so many different reasons. It is justified, in some people's cases, violence. It is justified extreme oppression of women. It has been used to justify slavery. Miroslav Volf has written on this question, and whom I think I've read about everything, says that such uses are a malfunction of religion, Christianity and Islam. And he argues that the question at the core of all major traditional religions, Orthodoxy, Islam, every one, is the question of what is human flourishing. Every one of them has this question embedded at the center. I know it's at the center of Orthodoxy. I'm not as familiar with Islam, but some of my colleagues at Mercer who do practice Islam tell me that question, that issue is what they would identify at the core of Islam, also of that tradition as well. So if we could revive that issue of what is human flourishing through these religious traditions in that dialogue, we will have a much richer, it seems to me, much less violent world. And I think we have to do that to survive. Okay? You know, I'm rarely clear, but I must have been clear. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wallace. Indeed, you were wonderfully clear. Thank you for those comments. And as director of the Keston Center, I thank you for promoting this center as a source of wonderful research and perhaps giving some folks some ideas of some ways that they can use the center in their research. And thank you particularly Steve Gardner and Larissa Seago for helping organize this wonderful symposium. Now, I would ask that those of you who can stay, join us for the final session, which is a panel of the symposium. It is titled Religion and Political Culture in Communist Countries, the Future. Steve Gardner will moderate, and our panelists will include Michael Bordeaux, Wallace Daniel, and Jun Wang. As I think about the trust that we have as part of those who take care of the archives and the materials that have been brought into the Keston Center, I am reminded of 1 Corinthians 4:2. Now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. My prayer is that we will all prove faithful. You are dismissed.